Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel on cleaning up heavy industry. My name is Claire Casey. I am the Global Head of Policy and Insights for Economist Impact, and I am delighted to be here today with this distinguished panel to dig into one of the most challenging and tricky issues in front of us as we think about building a more sustainable society and economy. Heavy industry accounts for a third of global emissions today. We often describe these sectors as the sector is hard to abate, because they're not just energy intensive, but have significant process emissions produced by the actual chemical processes used to create these products, whether it's steel or cement or aluminum. These are also the building blocks of our societies and economies. And so there is no net zero future without addressing emissions and overall sustainability in heavy industry. I am thrilled to introduce you to this panel today. We have Lord Gregory Barker, the independent chairman of the Ian Plus Group and former Minister of State for Energy and Climate of the United Kingdom. Michael Ray, the Chief Operating Officer of the Carbon Trust. Kentaro Hosomi, Chief Regional Officer and Chief Executive for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Faustine Delasalle, the Co-Executive Director of Mission Possible Partnership and the Director of the Energy Transitions Commission. Faustine, I want to start with you because I love the audacity of Mission Possible. Can you tell us, just to introduce us to this issue today, why you're hopeful, optimistic that there is positive change in front of us, that it's not just technically possible, but it's going to be affordable?
The reason why we published a report now 3 years ago called Mission Possible was because when reviewing the portfolio of solutions in the heavy industry sectors, we realized that there were multiple solutions, both to the energy emissions and the process emissions that we face across those sectors. So there wasn't any source of emission where we felt that there was no solution available. They're not necessarily commercially available, they're not necessarily cost competitive yet, but the richness of innovation from industry players at this point in time makes me and makes us as the Energy Transitions Commission very optimistic about our ability to find the right solutions. We've also, at the time, calculated that the cost of transitioning the whole heavy industry system to net zero emissions by mid-century wouldn't be much more than 1% of GDP, which felt reasonable from a macroeconomic point of view. It does represent a major challenge from an individual industry player point of view, and I'm sure we'll dig into that in a moment. So that made us, at the time, very optimistic. But at the time, there was little action that could be seen. And I think what makes me more optimistic today than I was probably 2 years ago is the amount of attention that those harder to abate sectors have received over the past 2-3 years. And the momentum that we see in industry, the number of industry leaders across those sectors that have now made net zero commitments, obviously encouraged by governments making net zero commitments. But beyond the net zero commitments, the number of players who are starting to announce very tangible investments in industrial scale plants. So that momentum is really incredible. That's something that we're obviously, through the Mission Possible partnership, trying to galvanize even more and to accelerate. But it's a good basis upon which to build. We're still a long way away from net zero industry, though.
Greg, you're sitting with one of the largest aluminum producers in the world. How are you addressing this challenge? How are you and other companies like yours moving towards this more net zero approach?
Well, it's great timing because yesterday we actually published our net zero route map. We announced that we were going net zero, the first in the aluminum sector to do so in January, but we also said, a credible target, and we've got a 2050 net zero, but also a 35% reduction for 2030. A credible target needs a credible plan. And I think you've seen about 2,000 companies now commit to net zero around the world, but only about 150 have actually brought forward detailed plans that actually align with science-based targets and Paris. So I'm sure there are a lot more to come, but that is key. You need a plan. So in our case, firstly, there's no silver bullet. There's about 10 different actions right the way down the production chain in aluminium. But we start with a huge advantage in that we're already the world's largest producer of low carbon aluminium, because 98% of the energy that we use for smelting comes from a clean energy source because we're also the world's largest producer of hydropower in the private sector. To put that in some sort of context, the Hoover Dam is 2 gigawatts of hydro, and we've got 16. So that gives you some flavour of the size. But we use that to make aluminium. But we still have a significant carbon content. If you use coal, it's about 18 tons of carbon to make 1 ton of aluminium. In our case, because we're using clean energy, it's only 2.5. So it's a big improvement. But getting that 2.5 to 0 is still going to be a real push. We're using something called inert anode, which is in the industrial process itself. So instead of that process giving off carbon, as the carbon anode degrades, it'll actually give off oxygen. So we're investing heavily in R&D, but I'd say the one thing that I think is most important is the will to do it. As Justine said, there are technical solutions out there. It's not easy by any means, which is why I think a lot of risk-averse CEOs at the pinnacle of their careers are perhaps worried about being the person that then goes and bets the farm for the next generation. But you've got to do it. There is no alternative. So we really do need corporate leaders to step up to the plate and realise we have to now enter a decade of fundamental transformation of many industrial processes in these hard-to-abate sectors.
Ken, you are not only representing a company that provides technology solutions. I know that Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is also doing a lot of really innovative partnerships with technologists and innovators and bringing new, higher risk, potentially, technologies to market. What's the role of innovation and technology here, and where do you see the greatest opportunity?
Yes, as you have correctly pointed out, yes, we have the technology and we have references on several scales. It depends on the progress of the products, but from, I would say, a demonstration stage to some commercial stage, yes, they are different in different stages of evolution. But looking globally, the hard-to-abate sectors, like the steel or the cement or chemicals, these industries account for a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. But these are also products which are indispensable for the growth in the global market. Looking at the developing countries in Asia and Africa, these countries need such kind of products on hand. So. Yes, our aim of partnership is it's not just bringing the technology, but enabling this sort of economic growth and infrastructure development while also decarbonizing. These three things have to come together. So it can not only be done by a single company or a single industry, but we also have to partner with various companies which have the expertise, knowledges, and bring onto such kind of a new innovation in order so that globally we can enjoy such kind of fruit without affecting the economic growth of each territory. So that is why we are very keen to partnership with various companies in finding the right solutions.
Great, thank you. Michael, how are we doing? If you look out at heavy industry today, and the Carbon Desk does tremendous work with companies and assessing progress, how are we doing? Where are the biggest gaps? Where are the biggest barriers?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the last 3 years, we've seen a step change in companies wanting to set science-based targets. And as Greg was saying, the real kind of benefit of getting into looking at kind of detailed plans and how one might deliver that, I think that's more kind of common in non-energy intensive sectors than energy intensive, but it's certainly starting to happen more recently in the energy intensive sectors. In terms of an assessment of where we've gotten to date, I think we've probably done the easy things. So, I mean, great progress on energy efficiency, as you would expect, given the input cost of energy. I think material progress on renewables and integrating renewables into the process, but a really big gap around kind of low carbon heat and kind of transforming the kind of core production process. And as others have touched on, I mean, these are potentially much more material investments and therefore much more difficult. But I think increasingly we're seeing companies wanting to commit to that because there really isn't an alternative other than to transform. And then the question is, do you go early or do you go late? And I think we would say, from the point of view of the environment, but also from the point of view of shareholder returns, going early, being a leader, being collaborative about how we do it, is the way that we're going to kind of transform in a way that's right for the environment and right for the economy.
That's great. You mentioned shareholder pressure. It would be interesting to hear from our business representatives where the pressure is coming on heavy industry. Obviously, there is increased attention from shareholders on the emissions and sustainability profiles of companies. There isn't as much of that sort of broad consumer trigger, right? Because these are intermediate goods usually. But are you seeing your customers demanding a different emissions profile as companies turn towards scope 3 emissions and looking at their broader footprint?
In the aluminium industry, not so much. In actual fact, part of the problem is that there's a lot of resistance from the B2B in the middle. You've got strong demand from consumer-facing businesses, I think, because they feel where public opinion is going. They feel where the market is going. So where is the big market for aluminium? In my case, it's electric vehicles, it's sustainable packaging, it's renewable energy infrastructure. All of these things are big consumers of our product. But before that sit the fabricators, the rolling mills, the people that make the parts and the components. And they are, often operating on quite narrow margins. Because these end consumers are also very powerful purchasers, with a lot of purchasing power and drive a very strong bargain. So there's the old-fashioned economics at play. So they're often slightly, worried that any change is going to drive up cost. That's a consistent theme. So we have been doing two things. One, trying to demonstrate that going green and being more expensive does not necessarily correlate. And actually, the real expense, the real risk is not to de-risk your business model by reducing your exposure to carbon. Because the cost we do know that's coming down the line, even if it's a little bit amorphous at the moment, is that carbon pricing is coming. If you look at this, whether it's CBAM in Europe, whether it's carbon regulation, whether it's carbon tax, other forms of border adjustment, it is coming. There's no way that you can look forward to the end of this decade and not see a serious price on carbon. And if you haven't moved your supply chains away from that, you haven't got a viable business. But it's still taking those first steps. The other thing that we do is to link up with those end consumers to sort of sometimes go over the heads of the supply chain or work with the supply chain. And a really good example, yesterday we announced that we had teamed up with can makers and with Budweiser to produce the world's lowest carbon content beer can, almost net zero, tantalizingly close, 0.01% carbon content. And we've done that by working with the supply chain and with the additional pull of having that well-known consumer brand in Budweiser, so N+ to Budweiser. So as one of our colleagues said, from mind to mouth. So it's, there's a lot of pull from consumers and investors. I started banging on about climate change when I first took on the non-exec role as chairman back in 2018. And, I used to get a few funny looks and people would, hear me out and then move on to going through the P&L and the et cetera and the standard questions. Now, even the most hard-bitten New York hedge fund manager wants to get straight into the ESG questions and really understand what we're doing on climate. And I think there's a lot of push on big industrial players from unexpected, unusual, not the usual suspects on their shareholder register?
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Ken, please jump in.
Looking at our customers, which are mainly the industrial customers and utility companies and these sort of industries, yes, we feel that they are, probably having great pressure. And because we see the number of inquiries for our carbon capture system increasing very heavily. And we are often invited to discussion regarding the use of hydrogen as an alternative fuel against fossil fuel, as well as where hydrogen itself is difficult to transport. Then we see the possible usage of ammonia as a hydrogen carrier, as well as directly serving as the replacement of fossil fuel. So these kind of discussion has increased dramatically in I would say, the past 1 year. So that
Ken,
yes,
can I break the rules and just ask you a question, if you don't mind me jumping in? When do you think that carbon capture is going to be commercially available for industrial customers?
At
scale?
It is already readily available. We have the largest scale plant in the United States already running for several years in Texas, which is carbon capturing from a coal-fired plant, and covering that will be used for enhanced oil recovery. So
outside the oil business, for the hard to pay industries, outside oil recovery, which some people would say isn't necessarily. We should be doing
on a smaller scale, we have it on the refineries as well as fertilizer plants, these kind of industries where in the process there is CO2 emissions which they need to abate, and these are readily available. And also we are having increasingly inquiries from the oil and gas sectors. I was the first example is not for the oil and gas sector itself. It was from the utilities, the coal-fired power plants, but from the oil and gas sectors for their scope 1 and 2, their processes, they recovering CO2 from that process. Those kind of inquiries are also increasing this very much. So there is a strong, I would say, inclination towards such kind of carbon capture from the existing processes. So this could work as a readily available solution before the alternate fuels such as hydrogen is really coming into the market, I believe. Yeah.
That's great. So we've talked about two things that necessarily have a pretty significant role from government in terms of regulatory frameworks and infrastructure, hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration at scale. Faustine, I wonder if you could reflect a little bit, since you're thinking broadly about the sort of pathways to this net zero future. What is the appropriate role of government? Are we moving fast enough and sort of setting up the necessary infrastructure to allow heavy industry to transition? And what should we be focused on and prioritizing?
It's a difficult question because obviously for most of the sectors that we're talking about, regulation is established on a national basis, whereas those sectors operate cross boundaries. And I think that's one of the key points of tension in terms of policymaking, that carbon border adjustment might be a solution for if it really takes off in Europe in particular. But it is difficult for sectors that operate across multiple continents to be regulated in a way that preserves a level playing field across competitors. And so that's the tricky issue that we really need to solve over the next couple of years. The difficulty to solve that is obviously how to have those intergovernmental discussions. They can't probably happen within a COP26 framework. These would involve too many countries. So we need smaller subsets of governments talking about each other around trade agreements and how do we include carbon in the context of trade negotiations. And that's a really critical dimension of policymaking, I think, for the years to come, for the heavy industry sectors in particular. Beyond that, I'd say there's obviously R&D support that is always required, but we're almost at the point where we need to go past R&D. What we really need to see, and that's what Ken was saying, is that we need to go from those initial plans, the examples that we can mention one by one, because there are not so many on the planet, and go from that to a deployment at the scale of 50, 100, 200 plants. And to get there, we will need government financial support to de-risk investment. I think most of the investment can probably come from the private sector. But at this point in time, the technology risk and the market risk is too high to unlock that financing flow. And so governments have a key role to play to ensure that there is enough certainty on the size of the market. Carbon pricing can help, but there are other mechanisms. If we think about regulations on products, for instance, regulations on buildings that would also regulate the type of materials that you use and the carbon intensity of the materials that you use, there's a range of different regulatory levers that can be pulled to provide more certainty to heavy industry players on the fact that there will be a market for greener products, and that also reduces the risk for financial institutions to invest. And that's really what we need to see, again, relatively fast.
I'm so glad you mentioned financing, because that's a big part of this puzzle. There are some innovative financing mechanisms that are coming to market. Ken, I know that you're thinking about this issue a lot. Could you share how Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is thinking about innovative financial tools?
Oh, yes. One thing is that at this stage, as Faustine has correctly mentioned, yes, we are in the stage of moving out from the laboratory to a demonstration and then to commercialization. The scaling up the technology already existing and bringing in new innovations. And in that sense, first, I think a collaborative approach rather than market competition is necessary at this moment. So, how to fund such kind of collaborative approach? This is also one thing which very much we are interested in, and talking with various governments about such kind of collaborative approach cross industries in bringing such kind of new solutions to the market. Yeah, this is one thing, and also. Even if we talk to our customers, I think they are heavily in need of some kind of predictive future for their investment to be recovered. So it means that there needs to be some kind of regulatory framework where that such kind of investment into new technologies like the carbon capture or hydrogen, these can be, commercially be, sustainable for the years to come for this investment to be made.
If I can jump in just with one thought on what Ken was saying, what is interesting in terms of that collaborative spirit that is quite new in this industry is that it also is super important to get projects off the ground in clusters. If we think, and you were asking about that earlier, about the hydrogen infrastructure, the carbon capture infrastructure, these are pieces of infrastructure that need to be shared across multiple industry players, across potentially multiple mobility players as well. And so finding the right collaborations locally is also very important to get those projects off the ground.
Fantastic. And Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think carbon pricing does have a critical role to play, and I take the point about it's kind of governments that kind of set the framework, but working towards kind of a global price on carbon is something clearly we should be doing, and trying to give much more certainty to industry about investment decisions and ensuring we have a level playing field. But I think one key lever is collaborative innovation. So if you look at kind of what's happened to the cost of offshore wind in Europe, going from 150 pounds per megawatt hour down to something like 40 or 50, and a large part of that was a number of big developers coming together to collectively invest and demonstrate innovations. and to also kind of bring forward the market and show, there is large demand there for technology providers who can deliver solutions. So yeah, I think collaboration has a massive role to play in helping to de-risk some of these technologies and get them to scale more quickly.
Fantastic. We're talking a lot about. Oh, sorry, Greg. I see you have something to add.
I was just going to strongly agree with what Michael said, and as someone that actually was in part responsible for the design of the market framework and government policy that gave birth to the offshore wind market, I think it's really important that you get that right and that you don't just give out government money willy-nilly, but you have mechanisms that really drive innovation, but also drive costs down. Because the big difference between the UK system for offshore wind and the German feed-in tariff system that predated it by more than 10 years was that it wasn't fixed, that it was a competitive auction that incentivized the price to come down rather than just create a benchmark that everyone priced up to. And it's very important that we keep that in mind when we call for concessional finance, that we really think about what is the best use of those very, very valuable. And, in post-COVID, there's going to be a lot of competition for those tax dollars. So we've got to be smart about that. And before we sort of put our hand in the public's pocket to take out subsidy, think about, regulation, because I think regulation is very underlooked, and setting a carbon price. And that's as someone's the new co-chair of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. That's hardly surprising that I'd say that.
That's great. I'm gonna stay with you for a moment. We've talked a lot about the challenges, but everyone here seems to be in agreement that a carbon price is coming. And I'm curious. 20 years ago, the conversation was all about exporting our emissions, exporting, our labor rights violations, exporting everything bad to developing countries. Are we at the edge of a sort of flip in terms of which countries are competitive? Those with affordable, abundant, renewable resources? Are we going to see a fundamental shift in sort of competitive into those environments that are better positioned?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You're absolutely on to something there, because historically, industry has gone to where the energy is. It started, in the north of England in the Industrial Revolution, where they found coal, and canals were built. We had the Lancashire cotton industry built around the Lancashire coal fields. You had shipbuilding built where there was, access to coal energy. And that all changed in the 20th century, in the latter part of the 20th century, as energy and labor got cheaper. It all went, first to India and then to China. And you've seen these huge global shifts. But you're absolutely right. Now labor costs are a relatively small part of many industrial processes compared to what they were 100 years ago. And energy is critically important, and carbon, as the price of carbon increases, it will change. So, when I was, cheerleading and the drive out of the renewables program in the UK, all of the major industries were saying, you're going to make us uncompetitive, you're going to drive manufacturing abroad, you'll ruin the country. Whereas now I look at, what China is saying, and China is, having to recognize that it's going to have to start closing its coal capacity, and going to have to start investing in much bigger, even greater than the progress they've made already in renewables, and fundamentally change their energy mix. And, who knows, maybe it will change again, but it's not the end of history. I think that you could see this tug back to those countries that were first movers on cost competitive renewable energy are going to be industrially competitive. And I think people are just waking up to that.
Michael, are you seeing that with the companies you're engaging with?
Is
that the driver? Is it future competitiveness?
It is, yeah. I think particularly from an energy point of view, because I think people are kind of seeing that kind of cost-effective, low-carbon energy is the way to go. So countries like the UK that are naturally advantaged in terms of offshore wind resource, or in North Africa in terms of solar, there is a kind of a massive opportunity to accelerate the development of hydrogen, and to kind of leverage that kind of natural competitive advantage into energy and then into related sectors. And that dynamic, I think, is happening, not only, I would say, in the UK and Europe, but also in China, as Greg was saying, that China sees, I think, a huge opportunity over time to have a kind of really strong low carbon energy sector.
But they've got to close a few coal-fired power stations before they get there.
I think they take the long-term view, Greg, on that one.
Yeah.
Ken, I think you have something to add.
Yeah, I would like to point, maybe not exactly in line with such this kind of discussion, but I think we have to look at the market because finally these kind of even the carbon tax, even though they are introduced, who is going to bear that effect? Is the market is going to be bearing such kind of tax in the end. And if you look at the market, the heavily populated areas are those which are the real markets in need of such kind of products. And such countries does not necessarily are blessed with, environmental, natural condition, environmental conditions fit for renewable energy. So this is one issue we have to think of. And also the issue of the global supply chain issue is coming, right? And no matter what the Chinese are saying at this moment, but it is clear that currently the market is benefiting from very low-cost Chinese products made from electric power fired by coal. So this is the reality of today's market. So we also have to keep those kind of voices of the market into our mind as an industry in order to, find the right way, right direction in things. So it's not as easy as, bringing all the industrial centers to renewable, strong points. I don't think this will solve the issue.
There's no one single solution, certainly.
I would say I think it's a significant part of the solution, but Ken raises a really good issue around the social implications of carbon price. And that's why one of the things that I want to bring to the debate in the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition is a wider discussion, a more inclusive discussion around a just transition to a low carbon future, and why we have to think about not just the direct economic advantages or consequences of pricing carbon, but also the unintended consequences and the social impacts. But the thing about carbon price, it will raise substantial new sources of revenue, and I think there needs to be a really thoughtful debate about how you spend those to ensure that those who are negatively impacted, particularly though the fuel poor, for example, that are still dependent on on fossil fuels, or those who are using fossil fuels for lighting and cooking, as many people are in developing countries. You've got to make sure that you share the proceeds of a switch to carbon pricing in a just and fair way, which is why it can't just be left to policy wonks to deal with this.
Absolutely. And I think that takes us beautifully to where I wanted to close this conversation, which is looking towards COP26 in Glasgow this coming November. Certainly equity is going to be at the center of the climate conversation there, and ensuring that we're building not only a cleaner future, but an inclusive one. I would just like to turn to each of you and ask the question, what are you looking for from COP26? And what do you think heavy industry should be bringing to the table? Maybe we'll start with you, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of building on what's already happening. So, heavy industry setting credible science-based targets with a material investment plan to 2050 to kind of fully decarbonize those sectors, and kind of getting into some detail about how they're going to do that. And I'd also like to see sectors or even cross-sector collaboration to go alongside that kind of government investment. Greg talked about it, but actually companies coming together to invest, to demonstrate technologies at scale, to get them down the cost curve and to get them viable in the marketplace.
Ken?
Yeah, Michael said it also almost. Not much more to say, but yes, I would really appreciate, well, we have a very a common target of net zero by 2050, and towards that, how we should transform the society in a way that we don't hurt such kind of leave out any people in globally of such kind of issues. This is a sort of discussion, practical discussion I would like to see in COP26.
Great. Faustine, what are you looking to see out of both governments, international institutions, and the private sector in COP26?
I really like the framing that Michael put forward, and actually the Mission Possible Partnership aims to deliver some of that by COP, some of those plans on how do we reach 2050, but most importantly 2030 targets, and what does it take to get there in terms of mobilization of different stakeholders in the value chain. But I think if the industry is stepping up pre-COP, which I very much hope and believe, we'll also need to call upon governments to respond present to those industry players and be ready both on a national basis and on an intergovernmental basis to talk about what really matters, including carbon pricing and level playing field.
And are you hopeful?
I'd say cautious optimism at this stage.
Okay, Greg, I'll turn to you now. What are you looking for in both of your hats? I think would be interesting to hear. What are you looking for from COP26?
Obviously, I want to see carbon pricing, and right back there in the centre of the solution policy toolkit. So I want to see that on the agenda. First and foremost, we need political leadership. That's the most important thing, because as Faustine makes clear, the solutions are there if there is the real will. And I think, we can't expect many business leaders to really go it alone, to really push the envelope on this and take significant risks. And, there are going to be winners and losers on the transition. It's not just, sometimes it's presented as it's all fine, it's all green, la, 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 la. Actually, no, it's not. Actually, there are going to be some phenomenal new companies. We're seeing them with like Tesla, etc. But also there are going to be some big losers. And there are a number of companies that just don't know how it's going to turn out for them. And it takes guts to really launch and go strongly. And they're not going to do that in time and in a way that's consistent with the Paris trajectory, unless there's really strong political leadership that says we're not going to put up with corporate leaders paying lip service to these goals, but not actually departing very strongly from business as normal during their watch. So we need big political will and a spotlight shone on business. But politicians also, government leaders need to turn up with a finance to help, particularly the global south, actually deal with many of these challenges, as well as dealing with the direct impacts of climate change, which are now no longer avoidable and which are happening right now. But I really hope it's political leadership and that industry wake up, smell the coffee and listen, and then take advantage of all the incredible work that Faustine's been doing, and listen to Michael and buy Ken's products, and we'll be sorted.
That's fantastic. I came into this conversation feeling like this was a very tough challenge. And I think it's been a really interesting conversation, pulling out another element of the complexity, which is the lack of the market signal. And the fact that these are still largely commodities that are very much being traded and viewed on a pure price basis still in markets. And so we really do need government action here, almost more than any other sector, to create that market signal, and also the criticality of the equity lens. And then we think about the fact that carbon pricing, not just at the national level, but at the global level, will have very different effects on very different markets, and where the demand might be in the places least able to capture or to cover that additional price. So really interesting challenges that are ahead of us, but also a lot of hope for what's to come. and what we might see out of the next couple of months in terms of much more tangible, concrete corporate commitments, and hopefully a greater energy and faster movement towards some sensible regulations to get us where we need on pricing and regulatory frameworks. Thank you, all of you, for your participation. And